to this. Now there's a call for the Judicial Service Commission to reform in order to reduce the influence of political parties on the appointment of judges. For more on this, or for more on why this is crucial, I'm joined by Alison Tilley, Coordinator for Judges Matter. Good afternoon, Alison, and thank you very much for your time. You've raised concern around the composition of the JSC, particularly politicians' participation. Talk to me about the concerns around this.
Well, the concerns, I think, have been coming on for some time. If you look back to the original formulation of the JSC, the idea was that you would need politicians in order to drive a transformation agenda. There was concern that the judiciary would push back and would be a stopping place for transformation, that they would resist transformation. And I think now we're in a position where there are no judges now who were judges then. So we've had a complete change. I'm not sure that means we've had transformation. And now the question is, what is the job of the politicians today, given that so much has changed in the last 20 years?
Mm-hmm. But could we really state with confidence that all the judges that probably sat on the bench pre-democracy are not there now? Because, yes, I cannot speak on the stats particularly, but many would argue that there are those. So as it stands right now, and we look at the Constitution, if we're going to confine ourselves to the Constitution, 178 subsection 1, it really speaks to the composition. And really, when I look at it this morning, it really spoke to a need for people from diverse walks of life, different interest groups that would speak, like you say, to transformation. And then when we speak of the advocates that sit on the JSC and we speak of the attorneys, they're also representing different interests within the legal profession, that if they're going to be asked questions around the interpretation of the law, you have those to answer to that. But if you're going to be answering questions from politicians, then it would talk around transformation. So wouldn't you think there's still a need to this day for such?
Well, you know, that's exactly the problem. Ideally, yes, of course, but unfortunately, that's not what the politicians are doing. And I think one of the reasons is that they have no articulated criteria as to what they're looking for in judges, and particularly in senior leadership positions and in the Constitutional Court. So the questions you get from politicians are random. They often reflect the issues of the day. If there's a politician who has a case in court, they'll usually try to get a free legal opinion of some of the advocates. I mean, it's very interesting, and I have to confess I do find it entertaining, but it's probably, well, almost definitely not the approach that you should be taking in an interview for a judge, where you are looking for very specific things that must be there in every single appointment. And I think that's the question.
So you're looking for a set criteria that would then distinguish who is appointable and who is not. But in the absence of politicians here, let me play devil's advocate. They could easily say that when they are questioning them on the issues of the day, it could be an issue around free education, because they want to know from which purview this particular judge sees the world. If you're going to have a situation where you're doing inspection in local, you've got a judge that must go to adjudicate on a matter pertaining to demarcation in, let's say, Alexandra. You get to Alexandra, there's a stand, but this stand has been divided into 3 or 4 other stands. And now, as a judge, you have to then judge as to who took over whose land, only to find that when you go there, you're not particularly familiar with the issues on the ground. So wouldn't you say that a judge should be a worldly person, therefore we need several interest groups to interview this type of a man or woman?
Well, you definitely need a few interest groups to interview this woman or man. But I think the question is really, are there kinds of questions that these candidates should be being asked? And what we've done is try to narrow it down to 4 or 5 kinds of questions that we think every candidate must be asked. One of them would be, what is your jurisprudential approach? It's a very broad question. We've heard it asked in some ways and you know, in other ways. Many candidates just don't get that question at all. and we fail to see how that's fair. You're in a job interview, you would expect to be asked similar questions to the other candidates, not exactly the same, but at least have the opportunity to say what you have to say about the core competencies of the work that you are being asked to do.
Fair enough. Speaking on the core competencies, we've watched several of these interviews because we're fortunate enough to actually have them broadcast live. When we speak of the core competencies, we've seen a number of these judges, aspirant judges, fail the one question on the Plascon-Evans rule. So there they were mostly asked about something. Yes, you're laughing. It has become a laughing matter because even us journalists now know the Plascon-Evans rule because we couldn't understand why they stumbled on this one. Now, if you have these individuals who would have been acting judges, who would be confronted with this rule on a daily basis, where they must make a determination as to whether they will actually need oral evidence or not. Now, you are seized with this on a daily, but when you come before the JSC, you're asked on the Plascon-Evans, you don't know. So what we've witnessed there is quite a lot of interesting things beyond just the questions outside of their competencies, as you say.
Well, look, it's something we've seen both in interviews of judges and interviews of magistrates, where people who have been in acting positions just do not know the law. And, you know, there is an argument, of course, that people have potential and they need to be given an opportunity. But judging is not something you can practice. It's like surgery. You have to be able to be a surgeon when you do an operation. You can't practice on some people first. And in many cases, we would argue that the criteria for acting judges and acting magistrates are not clear and not articulated, and different judge presidents do it differently. And you can end up with candidates who have an absolutely horrible track record.
Let me take you back to the politician's role and what really is the bone of contention here. When we speak about the influence that politicians can have, we're talking about the 6 that actually are placed in this JSC, and these are coming from several political parties, not just maybe the African National Congress. Now, with those 6, I take it that the reason we have them being from multi-parties is to also guard against any political party having too much influence in the process. So what would be the concern with just the 6 that comprise the bigger number of JSC candidates?
I'm just trying to work out in my head how we make up those 6, because you have a member of the DA, the EFF, and the IFP there, but the balance of the politicians are, I think, 6. And I think those 6 are ANC, as it happens to be constituted at the moment. There are some from the National Assembly and some from the National Council of Provinces. So there is definitely a significant majority party majority. And of course, you also have sitting in the JSC, you have the Minister of Justice and
yes. Then we have the Chief Justice, and then we also have the President of the Supreme Court of Appeal, etc. But with these, do you really believe they wield influence? Because I know where this story or the concern comes from, because we've got the issue around the deployment committee right now, that we have the African National Congress that would have this body that sits and then caucuses on the preferred candidates. One could argue that every political party must sit and have that caucus about the preferred candidates. But then when these candidates are brought to the JSC or before the JSC, are we not then casting aspersions on the independence of the JSC if we are to say what they would have decided upon as the ANC finds itself being implemented when it comes before the JSC? Does it not talk then of a compromised JSC according to you?
Well, I think we certainly made the point in our article that the deployment committee made a number of recommendations which don't seem to have been adopted by the JSC. Yes. And it's difficult to understand, what the point was. Something as concerning and potentially dangerous as a political party deploying judges when the fact of an independent judiciary is so essential to a constitutional democracy, and yet it didn't appear to have any effect on the actual appointments. So it's puzzling. I think one of the things that we have to come back to is that there are probably too many politicians in the JSC, and the politicians in the JSC really need to think about what their role is around actually identifying the criteria for the appointment of judges, and then seeing that those criteria are actually sought in the candidates and through the questioning.
No, I must say, though, that this is a conversation that has captured the minds of several in society. Many people are concerned around the independence of the judiciary and even this conversation of the ANC's deployment committee. I've once spoken to Johan Kriegler, a retired justice. He also has some sort of concern around the composition of the JSC. Hopefully, we'll expand on this conversation. Thank you very much for joining us. That's Alison Tilley just speaking to us on her concerns around the influence or the role that politicians play on the JSC.